I've got my voice back. This video is about advanced cleaning along with surface finish and minor flatness correction. The video and the ones in the future involving heads could be interpreted as promoting how to do full head rework at home, but that's not the intent. But yeah, I'm reworking heads at home. As I mentioned in the video of lapping the block decks, this technique was born out of correcting poor machine shop work. But it's also how I clean heads and decks that just need cleaning, although taking it further in this case for multiple layer steel gaskets. The 6.0 and the head gaskets can use all the help they can get. People should typically take heads to a machine shop. I'm trying to MacGyver my way through a poor choice of a motor that was a financial hit I can't repeat. I showed how I did hand scraping and then hand cleaning with 600 grit Scotch-Brite pads in part 1. These heads represent what would be expected at the dealer when doing head gasket replacement under warranty, and having to follow Ford's instructions to not machine the heads. This rebuilt motor ran 75,000 miles, so in relative terms it represents an engine under warranty. I said these two heads had different machine surfaces, one more of what I would expect in the aftermarket service industry. It's possible one head was machined at the rebuilder and the other was new from Ford. The passenger side had a crosshatch pattern, since the cutter touched the surface at both the leading and trailing edge in its travel. That's good from the perspective that it cut flat, not wallowed in the center, trammed to cut only on the leading edge. The other head was cut on a different setup, probably using a round CBN insert, leaving a different pattern. Smoother with a reflection, although not without its own faults. There was some chatter on the one end of the head, which I'll show later. But these heads represent two examples of many finish characteristics, depending on the tooling and setup of the milling machine. With a little of my routine cleaning, the RA reading shows both finishes were within what should be expected for a multiple layer steel head gasket. Which brings up the subject of surface finish measurements. I covered this extensively in the block deck video, where I dressed the decks because of the rough finish. But I'll recover the subjects for those who haven't seen the other video. I have an index for the different sections for those that may want to jump ahead. I may talk about the heads in another video. I'm expecting to. This motor is an endless source of opportunity. And if you have heads with O-rings, this video is relatively useless unless you can replace the O-rings yourself when reusing your heads. As with other auto manufacturers, Ford and International have no listed surface finish specifications for the heads or the decks, only for flatness and minimum thickness. But we have a lot of warnings to not change the surface finish, whatever that is. I can never understand why they don't include the spec. When commercial machinists have to make parts, they are given details for surface finish. So the automotive machinists have to rely on service industry groups or gasket manufacturers for specs, or what works for them from their own experience. Every modern industrial machine shop I've been to had a profilometer to measure finishes. It's just as critical as a micrometer. Yet there are automotive machine shops out there that don't have them, or engine builders, so they can't check what they get from the machine shop. Some do have surface finish comparator plates for visual and tactile subjective interpretation. When decks and heads are machined, you need to know if the work is correct, and the gasket will hold. And that's most critical with MLS gaskets. To me, it's essential to know if the shop that does the machining has the means to measure the surface. So what should this surface be? Without the vehicle manufacturers giving a spec as they do for almost everything else, we have to hunt for answers. Larry Carley is one of the most proficient writers in the automotive service industry. In one of his articles in the trade magazine Engine Builder, he discusses surface finishes for gaskets. He states the finish should be under 30 RA for a MLS gasket. And he notes some companies provide a thicker sealant for rougher finishes up to 60 RA. He also mentions RZ provides a better indication of the texture of the surface, and I agree. If you ask the Moly Tech Service, they say it should be better than 40 RA. And from Felpro's literature, they state OE is within a range of 20 to 30 RA. But their gaskets use a thicker sealant, which can be used with a finish as rough as 60 RA. Larry Carley has talked to Felpro. Let's go back to Larry Carley's article. He says when using an MLS gasket, the surface finish of 20 to 30 RA is smooth enough. But he also stated if you can get into the low teens or single digits, that would be great. So I posted the question to Felpro. Sentence after sentence is to go as smooth as possible. The smoother the finish, the easier and better it is for the gasket to seal. And if we look at Felpro's MLS gasket surface, these 5 layers mate together, and the stainless is an 8 RA, 47 RZ. So now we have a much smoother ideal. After all this, I have a spec for Felpro gasket, and what I believe is the OE finish requirement based on Felpro and Moly, and an ideal spec. Unless you're a professional machinist or engineer, these terms are a foreign language. What's the value of 30 microinch? To accurately measure a surface finish, you need a profilometer. And today, I wouldn't use a machine shop that did not have one. The profilometer measures a small length of the surface and can display the finish in many different parameters. The RA parameter is mostly used in the USA, but it's a narrow reading of the entire scanned surface. RZ is a better measurement as it averages 5 sample areas over the same stroke and can better indicate the variation of the surface. I also use RT when doing what I'm about to show you, so I'll know how deep the roughest marks are. The graph will show 2 conditions, the raw tracing and one that is normalized. In this example, we can see why RA can be so problematic. These are entirely different surfaces for the same RA. I mentioned earlier the finish comparator, which requires a subjective evaluation. Machinists historically have done well with these, but they use them every day. The plates have examples of the different machining processes, including the finest for lapping, surface grinding, or Blanchard grinding, something I did way too much a long time ago. The 8 to 32 RA is the range we would be using for the MLS gaskets. So to use the plate, you can compare visually, you can compare by feel. If that's a fingernail judgment, it changes depending on the thickness of the fingernail, bridging the grooves. Some judge by the reflective nature when targeting a low RA. But with today's MLS gaskets and the gasket issue with the 6.0, an educated guess may not be the best thing out of a machine shop. Macro flatness. I'll move to the subject of flatness. And to me, this is where it gets interesting. There has been a progression from the engine and vehicle manufacturer of the 6.0. My 2003 Ford service manual states to inspect the heads if they are warped, but gives us no diagram of how to check. The spec for flatness is no deviation of 0.02 of an inch over 2 inches, or 0.004 of an inch in any length. It does mention to check thickness to make sure the heads haven't been machined too thin at 95 millimeters or 3.74 millimeters. I thought we weren't supposed to machine heads. The 2006 service manual from International has the same specs, but they lay out a traditional pattern for checking flatness, along with the same warning to check if the head is too thin from being machined. Again, I thought we weren't supposed to machine these. After that 2006 manual was printed, Ford issued a TSB for a revised method of checking flatness. With a 30-year career working for a Ford supplier, TSBs always have a lot of background that is never seen by the public or by the service side of Ford dealers. It states, do not measure flatness lengthwise, only across the heads. There is a change in the flatness when the heads are bolted down. They are flexible. What they really are saying is there's a casting stress condition that bends the heads. I believe I'll talk about that more in another video. The outside frame by the intake ports stays put, but the main deck moves downward in this position. It's not a machining error. And since we indicate the setup of the head on the milling machine at these 4 points, we will see that shallow when resurfacing the heads. New heads as well as used heads. It seems like Ford's scientific research team got involved in this situation to me, based on my years of experience. On the second page of the TSB, they state to measure across the width in this area, and these are the 13 locations that are very critical. And another warning to not machine the heads. There is another update I can't see as I no longer have access to Ford's network, but it states it's about enhanced cleaning and measurement. But I may have a copy of it from 2014. The only thing I found afterwards is this information that is more descriptive of where to measure. And again, the 13 points that are the most important locations. The change in the specification can be easily overlooked though. They went from a deviation of 0.002 of an inch over 2 inches to 0.002 of an inch over the head's 6-inch width. That brings the allowed deviation per inch down by 1/3. That's not insignificant, and it's targeted across the width of the head. I also found another image that may come from International's network, since it doesn't carry Ford's image identification. It warns to check these 2 locations first. So how could you get a 0.002 of an inch feeler gauge under those 2 locations at the end of the straight edge? Because the heads bow convex when they run out of coolant from overheating. The center moves opposite to what we normally see. In my opinion, heads bowed like that should be tossed, because milling them would make that critical area of the head thin. By the warning, do not machine the heads. So the issues are surface finish and flatness. This chart shows that any operation like milling takes above standard work to generate a finish below 32 RA. It's much easier to achieve the smoother finish with abrasive finishing like grinding, honing, or lapping. And we all rely on abrasive machining for our engines. The stoning of decks and heads is a tentative discussion. At least you need a secret handshake. People say they do it with some reluctance, but there's not much helpful or detailed information about how to do it. And some of that reluctance is probably due they don't have a means to measure the surface. You can use a body tool to abrade the surface, but the flexibility is not a reasonable control for flatness. And this sure isn't. You can't control the abrasive consistency. You can just see the waviness in the pattern that is left behind. Machinists do use stones to clean burrs off of mounting surfaces or to lightly dress the edges of the parts they make. But there's not one of my stones I would use to prep a deck or head, because I know how much they wear and get at a flat. If we have an uneven surface and using something that's convex, we have single point contact. While it abrades, it will not improve the flatness of the surface. It will just follow the surface. And flipped, a two-point contact will do the same. And you can cause other issues more problematic when you are working on the block deck. A flexible, concave, or convex tool will cause a higher rate removal right where the gasket needs to seal the most, next to the cylinder bore. It also becomes challenging to keep the tool flat with a short length. It's too easy to bite with the leading edge. So you need something that can be kept in good contact and bridge the cylinders or other openings. The immediate reaction is that's what a milling machine is for. And while it improves the situation on a macro scale, which many heads need, there is always a forced reaction of the tool bit when it transitions open areas. Now you have a disparity on a minor scale. But that's what gaskets are about, sealing those variations. And I'll show the disparities when I'm working these heads. The gaskets will have more work to do when minor disparities line up. I use stones in my woodworking hobby to maintain chisels and planes. Stones wear unevenly, and I have to flatten the stones with a lapping plate. The plate I have has a large area, which helps in developing a flat surface, and it's certified to within 1/2 thousandths of an inch in all directions. It has a 160 grit diamond surface. Even though the grit is within acceptable area, the diamonds would tear up a metal surface. But it's suitable for holding things in place. This is an expensive plate, and I already have it. What is needed is a very flat surface. It would be heavy, but you could use a small granite plate like from Grizzly. It's actually flatter than my lapping plate. You would have to use double-sided tape on the sides to hold the sandpaper, not on the bottom surface. Or you could take your straight edge to a local metal supplier and check their cutoff bin for a flat piece. I refer to this technique as lapping, using the definition as an abrasive to control a finish, to smooth and flatten the surfaces. It's the same technique as stoning. I used a new machine shop that created a pour finish on small block Ford heads. 2 machinists working in our corporate experimental machine shop, who also raced at Englishtown, showed me how to do this. I certainly understand some people's skepticism. I'm not stating everyone has to do this. Most of you should really be using a good machine shop, as I usually do. But this technique has worked for me over 40 years to clean and correct surfaces that were not so bad they needed to be milled. And these 6.0 20mm heads are relatively flat. It's not an unknown task. There is a company out there that laps engine heads. But that's not something you can do in an attached 2-car garage. You can't use a normal lapping motion with a cylinder head unless you have a big granite surface plate. So I flip the process on its head. The pattern has to be a cross pattern that gives the best opportunity to flatten a plane. Since I don't want metal dust going in places that may be hard to clean, I use foam to seal off areas while dry abrading the heads. Caulk-saver foam for the holes and coolant passages. For the larger holes, I use pipe insulating foam. Any flat sheet foam could be used for the openings for the push rods. For cleanup, I use a brush and a vacuum. To measure how much material I'm removing, I used my 1/10,000th of an inch dial indicator mounted in a depth gauge stand, using the valves as my base for measuring. I didn't have to do the measurements. It would take a week to abrade off a substantial amount of metal. Typically with small block Ford engines that use composite gaskets, I've been using 60 to 80 grit. My first time with an MLS gasket, I started the cleaning with 150 grit. As I'm starting the process, let me show what the head surface reveals. Milling is not as flat as some would believe. As I do this, the shallows become more pronounced against the clean metal. With milling, there is some distortion of the tool bit as they transition past openings like the cooling passages and valve areas. I'm stopping here because at the very end of the head is where the highest drag is coming from as I abrade the surface. You can see there's full contact along the edge of the head. But from the cooling passages inward, including the combustion area, you can see I don't have full abrasion. The surface has fallen off. You can see small deviations from flat, especially along the sides by the openings. You can also see minor cupping in the center of the head. It's lower in this upside down position, but when installed on the engine, it's raised. Most of this is minor and what a gasket is designed to seal. It's just not as flat as it could be. And we always have the potential of the disparities lining up. The initial cleaning was with 150 grit paper, and I didn't change the surface all that much, only changing from 17 RA to an average 15 RA. That's very acceptable, and right where the surface for an MLS gasket should be. But now I'm moving on to 180 grit. I'll show the lapping process and the results in my typical redundancy. I do the ends first using fresh sandpaper. The grit will break down quickly against this tough surface, abrading as a finer grit. I typically change the paper way more than what I'm showing here. I don't use any force against the surface, but let the weight of the assembly do the cutting, so there's no forced distortion of the plate. I painstakingly try to make sure all surface areas have the same amount of abrasion. This is a long segment, but I think it's essential to show all of it if this process interests you. My handle is one of my welding triangles, my holders small super magnets. As the surface becomes smoother, you can see the reflection improving. And my hand position changes when necessary to do my best to keep the plate flat on the deck. This movement of the plate in this manner is for width flattening. This direction for length flattening, although what it accomplishes is minimal. What finish does 180 grit abrade to, so you don't have to buy a profilometer? And of course, a lot of measurements to show the variation. This area had tool chatter. Going back to the initial raw graph before the software normalizes, we can see how the crests and troughs are represented. We can also see the depth of the impression from the head gasket as it digs into the surface. Our team measures the spans maximum to minimum, and now we know how deep into the surface it was buried. But that's not accurate after I've already done some abrading. Working with 180 grit sandpaper achieves a relative uniform finish. In the center of the head it was slightly rougher due to the lower amount of abrasion because of the shallow from the cupping. But overall, from the comments by Larry Carley and the Felpro representative, this is a value that would be considered ideal. The chatter is not a significant issue. It just looks bad. And I could have stopped using only 150 grit paper, as the RA was very close to the original Ford surface finish. I'm going to recheck flatness, going overboard with details. I always do. The limit is 0.02 of an inch across the deck width. The far end past the push rods to be ignored. I'm not sure I would care for a head that has a deviation more than 0.01 of an inch. This section is inserted from the last video that I did with the light cleaning. My initial check showed these heads were not deviating more than 0.01 of an inch. That was the decision point for me, taking the heads to a machine shop or just lapping. After the 150 and 180 grit lapping procedure, I'm rechecking this with a 5/10,000ths of an inch feeler gauge. And I'm going all the way across. Ford's directional pattern on the left, and my pattern crossing the fastening locations on the right. So each time the feeler gauge dragged the straight edge, indicating it was thicker than any clearance below. How about something thinner than 5/10,000ths of an inch? First the driver's head. We can see a little light in some locations, but that is very acceptable. Now the passenger's head. In my opinion, an improvement over what people in the dealerships would have been told to do. I might readdress this again with 150 grit paper to get the finish more in the 12 to 15 RA range. I need to think about how far to take this. Under 10, over 10. So how did the passenger side head do? Especially if a crazed person goes overboard, as some may be thinking about doing right now.